The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her dress blue uniform. At 28, she had already served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. Her chest bore decorations that told stories most people couldn't imagine. The Navy Cross gleamed prominently among them, earned during a firefight that saved 12 Marines when her unit was ambushed in Helmand Province. Today was different. Today she was reporting to a new assignment that made her stomach twist with anticipation and dread. The Marine Corps had selected her for a special program at the Advanced Combat Training Center. She would be working with elite units, helping to develop new close-quarters combat techniques. It was an honor, but it also meant proving herself all over again. Maria walked through the main gate, her boots clicking against the concrete. She had learned long ago that respect in the Marines wasn't given because of rank or decorations. It had to be earned every single day, especially when you were a woman in a combat role. She had fought harder than most of her male counterparts, pushed herself beyond every limit, and still faced skepticism wherever she went. The Advanced Combat Training Center stood like a fortress in the distance. Its gray concrete walls and razor wire fencing made it look more like a prison than a training facility. Inside those walls, the most elite Marines in the Corps honed their skills. Force reconnaissance operators, Marine raiders, and other special operations personnel came here to push the boundaries of what was possible in combat. As Maria approached the main building, she noticed groups of Marines scattered around the courtyard. They moved with the confident swagger that came from knowing they were the best at what they did. Most of them were men, their bodies built like weapons from years of intense training. They talked in low voices, their conversations peppered with military slang and references to operations she could only guess at. A few heads turned as she passed. She caught fragments of whispered conversations that followed her. Some Marines nodded respectfully when they saw her decorations, but others looked skeptical. She had grown used to both reactions over the years. The reception desk inside the main building was staffed by a young corporal who looked barely old enough to shave. He glanced up from his computer screen as Maria approached, his eyes automatically scanning her uniform and decorations before meeting her gaze. Staff Sergeant Santos reporting for assignment to the Advanced Combat Training Center, she said, presenting her orders. The corporal took the papers and studied them for a moment. His eyebrows rose slightly when he read the details. "Ma'am, you're assigned to Building C, Advanced Close Quarters Combat Division. Colonel Martinez is expecting you at 0800. Maria checked her watch. She had 15 minutes to find Building C and get oriented. "Where can I find Building C?" "Straight through those doors, across the main courtyard, 3rd building on your left. You can't miss it, ma'am. It's the one with all the noise coming from inside." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of simulated gunfire echoed from somewhere in the distance, followed by shouting voices and what sounded like furniture being thrown around. Maria made her way across the courtyard, her mind racing with thoughts about what lay ahead. She had excelled in every combat training program the Marines had put her through: urban warfare, desert operations, mountain warfare, amphibious assault tactics. She had mastered them all and earned the respect of her instructors and peers through blood, sweat, and determination. But this was different. The Advanced Combat Training Center was where legends were made. It was where Marines came to learn techniques that could mean the difference between life and death in the most dangerous situations imaginable. The instructors here weren't just teachers. They were combat veterans who had seen and done things that most people would never understand. Building C loomed ahead of her, a 3-story concrete structure that looked like it had been designed by someone who prioritized function over form. The windows were small and reinforced, and the entrance was a heavy steel door that looked like it could withstand a direct hit from a mortar round. The sounds of combat training grew louder as she approached. Through one of the windows, she could see Marines grappling on padded mats, their movements quick and violent. Others were practicing with weapons, their actions smooth and practiced from countless hours of repetition. Maria paused outside the entrance, taking a deep breath. She had been through this routine hundreds of times before. New assignment, new group of Marines to prove herself to, new challenges to overcome. But something about this place felt different. The atmosphere was charged with an intensity she had rarely experienced outside of actual combat zones. She pulled open the heavy door and stepped inside. The interior of Building C was a maze of training rooms, each one designed for a specific type of combat scenario. The main hallway was lined with photographs of Marines who had distinguished themselves in combat, their faces bearing the hard expressions of men and women who had stared death in the face and emerged victorious. The sound of her boots on the polished floor echoed through the hallway as she made her way toward what she assumed was the main office. Along the way, she passed training rooms where Marines were engaged in various forms of combat practice. In one room, a group was working on knife fighting techniques, their movements precise and deadly. In another, Marines were practicing close-quarters shooting, their weapons firing rubber bullets at human-shaped targets. Each room she passed made her more aware of the caliber of Marines she would be working with. These weren't ordinary infantry soldiers. These were the elite of the elite, men and women who had proven themselves in the most dangerous situations imaginable. As she reached the end of the hallway, Maria found herself standing in front of a door marked Colonel Martinez, Commanding Officer. She knocked twice and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," a gruff voice called from inside. Maria opened the door and stepped into a Spartan office that looked more like a military briefing room than a traditional office space. Maps covered the walls, marked with colored pins and annotations that suggested recent operations in various parts of the world. Behind a metal desk sat a man who looked like he had been carved from granite. Colonel Martinez was in his late 40s, his hair gray at the temples, and his face bearing the kind of scars that came from years of combat experience. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and his decorations rivaled Maria's own impressive collection. When he looked up from the papers on his desk, his eyes were sharp and assessing. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, rising from his chair. "I've been reading your file. Very impressive record. 3 Bronze Stars, a Navy Cross, multiple combat deployments. You've certainly earned your place here." "Thank you, sir," Maria replied, standing at attention. "At ease," Martinez said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I want to talk to you about why you're here and what we expect from you." Maria took the offered seat, maintaining her professional composure while her mind raced with possibilities about what her assignment would entail. "The Advanced Combat Training Center is where we send our best Marines to become even better," Martinez continued. "We develop new techniques, test new equipment, and push the boundaries of what's possible in combat situations. Your job here will be to help us develop and refine close-quarters combat techniques that can be taught to Marines across the Corps." He leaned back in his chair, studying her face carefully. "But I'll be honest with you, Staff Sergeant. You're going to face some challenges here that have nothing to do with your technical abilities. Many of the Marines in this facility have never worked with a woman in a combat role, let alone taken instruction from one." Maria had expected this conversation. It was one she had had with commanding officers many times throughout her career. "Sir, I understand the challenges. I've dealt with similar situations before." "I'm sure you have," Martinez nodded. "But this is different. The Marines here aren't just confident. They're cocky. They've been told they're the best of the best, and they believe it. Some of them might not take kindly to being taught by someone they perceive as an outsider, regardless of your qualifications. Sir, my record speaks for itself. I've proven my abilities in combat and in training environments." "Yes, you have," Martinez agreed. "And that's exactly why you're here. But proving yourself to a bunch of Special Operations Marines who think they already know everything is going to require a different approach than what you might be used to." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training courtyard where Marines were engaged in various forms of combat practice. "There's a group of Marines here, 27 of them, who make up our most elite close-quarters combat unit. They're good at what they do, maybe the best I've ever seen. But they're also arrogant and set in their ways." Maria felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had dealt with arrogant Marines before, but something in Martinez's tone suggested this group would be particularly challenging. "These Marines have been training together for 2 years," Martinez continued. "They've developed their own methods, their own culture, their own way of doing things. They don't like change, and they don't like outsiders telling them how to improve." "What exactly are you asking me to do, sir?" Martinez turned back to face her, his expression serious. I'm asking you to teach them. To show them new techniques, new approaches to close-quarters combat. To help them become even better than they already are. And they don't know I'm coming. They know someone new is being assigned to work with them. They don't know it's you. Martinez's expression was grim. I wanted to see how they'd react to you without any preconceptions. Maria understood. It was a test, not just for her, but for the Marines she would be working with. How they treated a highly decorated female Marine would say a lot about their professionalism and their readiness to adapt to changing circumstances. When do I meet them? Right now, Martinez said, checking his watch. They're in training room 7, working on urban assault tactics. I'll walk you down there and make the introductions. As they left the office and made their way through the halls of Building C, Maria could feel the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just another assignment. This was an opportunity to prove that the Marine Corps was ready to fully integrate women into all aspects of combat operations. But it was also a chance for her to learn from some of the most skilled Marines in the world. The sounds of combat training grew louder as they approached Training Room 7. Through the reinforced glass windows, Maria could see a group of Marines engaged in what looked like urban combat simulation. They moved with the fluid precision of a well-oiled machine, each one knowing exactly where the others would be and what they would do in any given situation. Remember, Martinez said quietly as they reached the door, these Marines respect competence above all else. Show them what you can do, and they'll follow you anywhere. Fail to measure up to their standards, and they'll make your life miserable. Maria nodded, her jaw set with determination. She had faced skeptical Marines before and won them over through skill and professionalism. This would be no different. Martinez opened the door to Training Room 7, and the sound of simulated combat filled the hallway. The 27 Marines inside were in the middle of what appeared to be a complex urban assault scenario, their movements coordinated and precise as they cleared mock buildings and eliminated threats. As soon as Martinez entered the room, all activity stopped. The Marines immediately came to attention, their weapons lowered, and their eyes fixed on their commanding officer. Gentlemen, Martinez's voice carried easily across the large training room. I want you to meet your new instructor. All eyes turned to Maria as she stepped into the room behind Martinez. She could see the immediate reactions on the Marines' faces. Surprise, skepticism, and, in some cases, barely concealed hostility. She had expected this, but it still stung to see the doubt in their eyes. This is Staff Sergeant Santos, Martinez continued. She's here to work with you on advanced close-quarters combat techniques. Staff Sergeant Santos has 3 combat tours under her belt and holds the Navy Cross for actions in Afghanistan. The room was silent as the Marines processed this information. Maria could see them sizing her up, their eyes taking in her small frame, and wondering how someone who looked like she did could possibly have anything to teach them about combat. One of the Marines, a tall man with sergeant stripes, and the kind of build that suggested he spent most of his free time in the gym, stepped forward slightly. Sir, with all due respect, we've been working together as a unit for 2 years. Our techniques have been proven in combat situations. What exactly is Staff Sergeant Santos going to teach us that we don't already know? Martinez looked at Maria, giving her the opportunity to answer for herself. Maria stepped forward, her voice calm and confident. I'm here to learn from you as much as I am to teach. But I've developed some techniques in combat situations that might be useful to your unit. I'd like the opportunity to demonstrate them and see if they can improve your already impressive capabilities. The tall Marine looked skeptical. What kind of techniques? Close quarters disarmament, multiple attacker scenarios, improvised weapon use, and rapid target acquisition in confined spaces, Maria replied without hesitation. Another Marine, this one with corporal stripes and a face that looked like it had been through several fights, snorted softly. Lady, no offense, but we've been doing this for a long time. We know all about close-quarters combat. Maria felt a flash of anger, but kept her expression neutral. She had heard variations of this dismissal many times before. I'm sure you do, Corporal. But sometimes a fresh perspective can reveal improvements even in techniques that seem perfect. The corporal exchanged glances with several of his fellow Marines, and Maria could see the skepticism spreading through the group like wildfire. She realized that words weren't going to be enough to win over these Marines. She was going to have to show them what she could do. "Colonel Martinez," she said, turning slightly toward her commanding officer, "would it be possible for me to demonstrate some of these techniques?" Martinez nodded slowly. "I think that's an excellent idea. Gentlemen, clear the center of the room. Let's see what Staff Sergeant Santos can show us." The Marines moved to form a loose circle around the center of the training room, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. Maria could feel their eyes on her as she removed her dress blue jacket and rolled up her sleeves. The room had grown quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of training from other parts of the building. "What would you like me to demonstrate?" Maria asked Colonel Martinez, her voice steady despite the weight of 27 pairs of eyes watching her every move. Before Martinez could answer, the tall sergeant who had spoken earlier stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant, if you don't mind me asking, what makes you think you can teach us anything about close-quarters combat? We train 8 hours a day, every day. We've been in more firefights than most Marines see in their entire careers." Maria turned to face him directly, noting the challenge in his voice and the way several other Marines nodded in agreement with his words. "What's your name, Sergeant?" "Sergeant Thompson, ma'am." "Well, Sergeant Thompson, you're absolutely right that training and experience are crucial. But sometimes the most dangerous assumption a warrior can make is that they've learned everything there is to know." She paused, letting her words sink in. "In Helmand Province, I learned that the difference between living and dying often comes down to techniques that take 2 seconds to execute, but a lifetime to master." Thompson crossed his arms over his chest. "And you think you can teach us these techniques?" "I think I can show you some things you might not have seen before. Whether you choose to learn from them is up to you." Colonel Martinez stepped into the conversation. "Sergeant Thompson, why don't you help Staff Sergeant Santos with her demonstration? Show her one of the disarmament techniques your unit uses." Thompson's eyes lit up with what looked like anticipation. Maria recognized the expression. She had seen it countless times before on the faces of Marines who thought they were about to prove a point by showing up the new person. "Be happy to, sir," Thompson said, moving to the center of the circle. He pulled out a rubber training knife, the kind used for close-quarters combat practice. "Standard knife disarmament scenario, ma'am. I come at you with the blade. You try to disarm me." Maria nodded and took her position facing Thompson. She could see the confidence in his stance, the way he held the training knife with practiced familiarity. This was clearly a scenario the unit had practiced hundreds of times. "Ready?" Thompson asked. "Ready." Thompson moved forward in a textbook knife attack, his approach aggressive but controlled. The technique he used was standard military doctrine, the kind taught in basic combat training across all branches of the service. It was effective and time-tested, but also predictable to someone who had seen it as many times as Maria had. Instead of using the standard defensive techniques Thompson was expecting, Maria did something that took less than 2 seconds but left the entire room speechless. As Thompson committed to his attack, Maria shifted her weight and moved in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Her left hand deflected his knife arm, while her right hand struck a pressure point on his wrist that caused his fingers to involuntarily open. The training knife clattered to the floor as Maria continued her movement, using Thompson's momentum against him to put him in a submission hold that left him completely immobilized. The entire sequence took exactly 2 seconds. Thompson found himself face down on the training mat with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that would have been extremely painful if Maria had applied full pressure. His face showed shock and confusion as he tried to understand what had just happened. "What the hell?" he muttered into the mat. The rest of the Marines stood in stunned silence. Several of them had pulled out their phones to record the demonstration, but the speed of Maria's technique had been too fast for most of them to follow. Maria released Thompson and helped him to his feet. "The technique I just used combines elements of traditional military combat training with pressure point attacks I learned from a Marine who had studied martial arts before enlisting. It's designed to work against opponents who are bigger and stronger than you are." Thompson rubbed his wrist, his expression no longer skeptical, but not quite convinced either. "That was unexpected. But knife attacks don't always come from the front like that. What if I came at you from behind? Maria nodded. Good point. In Afghanistan, most of the close-quarters combat situations I faced involved multiple attackers coming from different angles. Would you like to see how these techniques work in that scenario? Multiple attackers? The corporal who had spoken earlier stepped forward. Lady, that's not how training works. You can't take on multiple opponents at once. That's movie stuff. Actually, Maria said calmly, it's Tuesday afternoon in Helmand Province stuff. But you're right that it's not normally part of training scenarios. She looked around the circle of Marines. How many of you would like to try? Several Marines exchanged glances. The challenge in Maria's voice was unmistakable, and none of them wanted to back down in front of their peers. I'll go, said a Marine with Lance Corporal stripes and arms covered in tattoos. But this seems like a good way for someone to get hurt. We'll use the same safety protocols you use in your regular training, Maria replied. Rubber weapons, controlled strikes, and I'll tap out if anyone gets me in a submission hold. Colonel Martinez stepped forward. Are you sure about this, Staff Sergeant? These Marines train together every day. They know each other's fighting styles and techniques. I'm sure, sir. Maria's voice carried a confidence that made several of the Marines look at her with new interest. Thompson picked up his training knife from the floor and looked at the Lance Corporal. You want to take her from behind while I come at her from the front? Sounds good, the Lance Corporal replied, pulling out his own rubber training weapon. The two Marines positioned themselves on opposite sides of Maria, their movements coordinated from months of training together. The rest of the unit formed a wider circle, giving them room to maneuver while maintaining clear sight lines to watch the demonstration. Ready when you are, Maria said, settling into a relaxed stance that didn't favor any particular direction. Thompson and the Lance Corporal made eye contact across the circle, communicating without words the way Marines who had trained together for years often could. They moved simultaneously, Thompson coming at Maria from the front while the Lance Corporal approached from behind. What happened next defied everything the watching Marines thought they knew about close-quarters combat. Maria moved like water, flowing between the two attackers in a way that used their own momentum against them. Her first movement took her out of the line of attack from both Marines, while her second movement put Thompson directly in the path of his partner's advance. The Lance Corporal, committed to his attack and unable to stop his forward momentum, collided with Thompson just as Maria's hand struck a nerve cluster on his shoulder that caused his entire arm to go numb. The training weapon fell from his useless fingers as he stumbled into his partner. Before either Marine could recover, Maria had moved behind them and applied pressure to specific points on both of their necks. Not enough pressure to cause injury, but enough to demonstrate that she could have rendered them unconscious if the situation had been real. The entire sequence took 3 seconds. Thompson and the Lance Corporal found themselves on the ground, confused and disoriented, while Maria stood over them with barely a hair out of place. Jesus Christ, someone whispered from the circle of watching Marines. Maria helped both Marines to their feet, checking to make sure neither was injured. The key to fighting multiple opponents isn't strength or speed, she explained as Thompson flexed his fingers to restore feeling to his hand. It's understanding geometry and using their aggression against them. A different Marine, this one with corporal stripes and the kind of scars that suggested extensive combat experience, stepped forward. That's a neat party trick, Staff Sergeant, but real combat isn't that clean. People don't attack in neat patterns like that. Maria nodded. You're absolutely right, Corporal. Williams, ma'am. Corporal Williams. Real combat is messy and unpredictable, but the principles behind these techniques work even when everything goes wrong. She paused, studying the faces of the Marines around her. In Helmand Province, I used these techniques when my squad was overrun by Taliban fighters. 12 Marines were pinned down by superior numbers, and traditional tactics weren't working. The room grew quiet as Maria continued. I had to neutralize 4 enemy combatants in a confined space while under fire. The techniques I used are the same ones I just demonstrated, adapted for life-or-death situations. Sergeant Thompson, who was still rubbing his wrist, looked at her with new respect. You're talking about the action that earned you the Navy Cross? I am. I read about that engagement in the Marine Corps Gazette, Thompson said. The article didn't go into details about the close-quarters fighting, Military publications rarely do, Maria replied. They focus on tactics and strategy, not on the split-second techniques that keep Marines alive when everything else fails. Another Marine, this one with sergeant stripes and the weathered face of someone who had spent years in combat zones, raised his hand. Staff Sergeant, I've got to ask, where did you learn techniques like that? They don't teach that stuff in boot camp. No, they don't, Maria agreed. I learned the basics from a Marine named Rodriguez who had studied Filipino martial arts before enlisting. After my first deployment, I spent my leave time training with instructors who specialized in techniques designed for smaller fighters facing larger opponents. Filipino martial arts? The scarred corporal looked intrigued. Like what they call Kali, Eskrima, Arnis. They're all related systems that were developed by people who often had to fight for their lives against opponents who were bigger, stronger, and better armed than they were. Maria gestured to the Marines around her. Most of you have significant size and strength advantages over the enemies you're likely to face. But what happens when you don't? The question hung in the air as the Marines considered scenarios they hadn't thought about before. What if you're injured and can't rely on your normal physical advantages? What if you're facing an opponent who's trained in the same techniques you know? What if you're captured and have to fight your way out using only improvised weapons? Colonel Martinez stepped back into the conversation. Those are exactly the kinds of scenarios we need to prepare for. The enemies we're facing now are better trained and more sophisticated than they were 20 years ago. Thompson nodded slowly. So these techniques, they're not meant to replace what we already know. They're meant to supplement it. Exactly, Maria said. Think of them as tools in a toolkit. The more tools you have, the better prepared you are for situations you haven't encountered before. The Lance Corporal who had attacked her earlier was flexing his shoulder, working feeling back into his arm. That nerve strike you used, how long would that last in a real fight? Depends on how much pressure I applied, and where exactly I hit. Anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes. Long enough to neutralize the threat, and move on to the next one. And you can teach us these pressure point techniques? I can teach you the ones that are practical in combat situations. There are dozens of them, but only about 10 that you can reliably use when you're under stress and fighting for your life. A new voice spoke up from the back of the group. What about weapons? Do these techniques work when the other guy has a gun? Maria turned toward the voice and saw a Marine with Staff Sergeant stripes and the kind of confidence that came from years of successful leadership. What's your name, Staff Sergeant? Rodriguez, ma'am. And, before you ask, no relation to the Rodriguez you mentioned earlier. Maria smiled for the first time since entering the room. Gun disarmament is actually where these techniques are most useful. Traditional military doctrine focuses on keeping distance from armed opponents, which makes sense in most situations. But, when you don't have a choice, when you're close enough that the gunman can't miss, you need techniques that work in that critical distance. Show us, Rodriguez said simply. Maria looked at Colonel Martinez, who nodded his approval. Who has a training pistol? Several Marines reached for the rubber training weapons on their gear belts. Thompson stepped forward, holding a replica of a standard-issue M9 pistol. Standard scenario, Thompson said. I've got you at gunpoint, close range, and I'm about to pull the trigger. Maria positioned herself about 3 feet from Thompson, well within the range where a pistol shot would be impossible to miss. Thompson raised the training weapon and pointed it directly at her chest. Any last words? Thompson asked with a grin that showed he was enjoying the demonstration despite his earlier skepticism. Just one, Maria replied. Duck. Before Thompson could react, Maria moved in a blur of motion that left every Marine in the room questioning what they had just witnessed. Her movement was so fast that it seemed to defy physics, and, when it was over, she was holding the training pistol while Thompson stood empty-handed with a shocked expression on his face. The weapon transfer had taken exactly 1 second. How the hell? Thompson started to say, then stopped when he realized that everyone in the room was staring at them in complete silence. Maria handed the training pistol back to Thompson. The key is understanding that most people, even highly trained Marines, have a reaction time of about half a second when something unexpected happens. If you can move faster than their ability to process and react, you can control the outcome of the encounter. Corporal Williams stepped closer, his earlier skepticism replaced by intense interest. That looked like magic, Staff Sergeant. There's no way that could work against someone who was really trying to kill you. You're right to be skeptical, Maria replied. And you're right that it wouldn't work against someone who was expecting it. But most combat situations involve elements of surprise and confusion. When someone's adrenaline is pumping and they're making split-second decisions, techniques like this can mean the difference between life and death. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez crossed his arms and studied Maria carefully. I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. Where exactly did you learn techniques like that? Combat, Maria said simply. And from instructors who learned them in combat. The martial arts I studied provided the foundation, but the techniques I use now have been refined through real-world application. Real-world application meaning you've actually used these techniques to kill people, Thompson said, and there was no challenge in his voice now, only professional respect. I've used these techniques to survive combat situations where traditional approaches weren't sufficient, Maria replied carefully. The goal is always to neutralize threats and accomplish the mission while keeping yourself and your fellow Marines alive. The room fell quiet again as the Marines processed what they had witnessed and what Maria had told them. These were experienced combat veterans, men who had seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine, and they were clearly impressed by what they had seen. Colonel Martinez stepped forward. Gentlemen, I think we've seen enough for today. Staff Sergeant Santos will be working with your unit on a regular basis, helping to develop and refine these techniques for broader use across the Corps. Sir, Sergeant Thompson said, speaking for the unit, I think we'd all like to learn more about what Staff Sergeant Santos has to teach us. Good, Martinez replied. Your first formal training session will be tomorrow morning at 0800. Staff Sergeant Santos will be developing a curriculum based on your current capabilities and the scenarios you're most likely to encounter in combat. As the Marines began to disperse, several of them approached Maria directly. Ma'am, Lance Corporal Jackson said, I just wanted to say that what you showed us today was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Thank you, Lance Corporal. But remember, what you saw today was just a demonstration. The real training starts tomorrow. Corporal Williams stepped up next. Staff Sergeant, I owe you an apology. I made some assumptions about what you could teach us, and I was wrong. Maria nodded. Apology accepted. But I understand why you reacted the way you did. I've had to prove myself to skeptical Marines many times throughout my career. Well, you've definitely proven yourself to us, Williams said with a grin. As the last of the Marines filed out of the training room, Maria found herself alone with Colonel Martinez. The adrenaline from the demonstration was beginning to fade, and she could feel the familiar exhaustion that came after proving herself to yet another group of skeptical Marines. That went better than I expected, Martinez said, reviewing the notes he had taken during the demonstration. They're good Marines, Maria replied. Once they saw that I had something useful to offer, they were willing to listen. And what you showed them today was genuinely impressive. I've seen a lot of combat techniques over the years, but nothing quite like that. Maria shrugged. It's just training and experience, sir. Any of those Marines could learn to do the same things if they were willing to put in the time and effort. Martinez studied her face carefully. You make it sound easy, but I suspect there's a lot more to it than that. There is, Maria admitted. But that's what training is for. Tomorrow we'll start breaking down these techniques into components they can master step by step. And you're confident you can teach them effectively? Yes, sir. They're already skilled fighters with good instincts and excellent physical conditioning. Adding these techniques to their existing capabilities will make them even more effective in combat situations. Martinez nodded. Good. Because the situations our Marines are facing are becoming more complex and dangerous every year. We need every advantage we can get. As they left Training Room 7 together, Maria felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in months. The challenge of winning over the 27 Marines hadn't been easy, but she had done it through competence and professionalism rather than rank or reputation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she began the actual process of teaching these techniques to Marines who were accustomed to being the best at everything they did. But today had proven that they were willing to learn, and that was all she needed to know. The next morning arrived with the same California sun, but everything felt different as Maria made her way to Training Room 7. She had spent the night developing a curriculum that would challenge the 27 Marines while building on their existing skills. The coffee in her hand was her third cup of the day, and the stack of training materials under her arm represented hours of preparation. She arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to set up the training space and review her notes one final time. As she approached the door to Training Room 7, she could already hear voices from inside. The Marines had arrived early as well. When Maria entered the room, she found all 27 Marines already present, dressed in their physical training gear and standing in formation. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward as soon as she appeared. "Staff Sergeant Santos, the unit is present and ready for training," he announced formally. Maria set down her materials and looked at the assembled Marines. Their attitude was completely different from the day before. Where she had seen skepticism and barely concealed hostility, she now saw professional respect and genuine curiosity about what she would teach them. "Good morning, Marines," she said, her voice carrying easily across the training room. "Today we're going to start with the fundamentals. What you saw yesterday were advanced applications of basic principles. Before you can use these techniques effectively in combat, you need to understand the science behind them." She gestured for the Marines to sit on the mats that covered the floor of the training room. "The first thing you need to understand is that these techniques aren't about being stronger or faster than your opponent. They're about understanding human physiology and using that knowledge to your advantage." Lance Corporal Jackson raised his hand. "Ma'am, when you hit Thompson yesterday, what exactly did you do to make his hand open like that?" Maria smiled. It was exactly the kind of question she had hoped for. "Excellent question, Jackson. The human hand has several nerve pathways that control grip strength. If you know where those pathways are and how to disrupt them, you can cause someone to lose their grip involuntarily." She moved to the center of the group and knelt down on the mat. "I need a volunteer, someone who's confident in their grip strength." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward. "I'll do it, ma'am." "Perfect. Rodriguez, I want you to grab my wrist with your dominant hand and hold on as tightly as you can. Don't let go no matter what I do." Rodriguez wrapped his hand around Maria's wrist, his grip tight enough that she could feel her circulation being restricted. He was a big man with hands that looked like they could crush a walnut, and his grip was firm and confident. "Now," Maria said to the watching Marines, "Rodriguez is probably 50 pounds heavier than I am, and his hands are significantly larger than mine. Under normal circumstances, there would be no way for me to break free from his grip using pure strength." She demonstrated by pulling against Rodriguez's grip with her free hand, showing the Marines that she couldn't budge his hold through force alone. "But if I apply pressure to the right nerve pathway," Maria moved her free hand to a specific point on Rodriguez's wrist and applied gentle pressure with her thumb. Rodriguez's eyes widened in surprise as his grip involuntarily loosened, and his hand fell away from Maria's wrist despite his obvious effort to maintain his hold. "What the hell?" Rodriguez said, staring at his hand in confusion. "It just stopped working." "The radial nerve controls several functions in your hand and forearm," Maria explained to the group. "Apply pressure to the right point, and you can temporarily disrupt those functions." Corporal Williams leaned forward, his interest obvious. "How long does that last?" "In this case, just a few seconds because I used very light pressure. In combat, you would apply much more force, which could cause numbness lasting several minutes." Thompson raised his hand. "Staff Sergeant, is this the kind of thing that could cause permanent damage?" "Good question. These techniques can be dangerous if used improperly, which is why we're going to spend a lot of time practicing with light pressure before we work up to combat applications." She looked around the group of Marines. "Everyone needs to understand that what we're learning here could seriously injure someone if used incorrectly." "Understood, ma'am," several Marines said simultaneously. Maria stood up and moved to a whiteboard that had been mounted on one wall of the training room. "Let's talk about the theory behind pressure point attacks before we practice any more techniques." She began drawing simple diagrams showing the location of major nerve clusters in the human body. The human nervous system has several vulnerable points that can be accessed without causing permanent damage. These points have been known to martial artists for centuries, but they're also supported by modern medical science. As she drew, the Marines asked questions that showed they were thinking seriously about the applications of what she was teaching them. "Ma'am," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez said, "in Afghanistan, we had situations where we needed to subdue suspects without killing them. Would these techniques work for that kind of scenario?" Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the most practical applications of these techniques for Marines in today's operating environment. Maria turned from the whiteboard to face the group. How many of you have been in situations where you needed to control someone without using lethal force? Almost every hand in the room went up. Traditional military training focuses heavily on lethal force applications, which makes sense for combat operations. But modern deployments often require Marines to act more like police officers than soldiers. She gestured to the diagrams on the whiteboard. These techniques give you options between shouting orders and shooting people. Lance Corporal Jackson spoke up again. That would have been useful in Iraq. We had a lot of situations where people weren't exactly hostile, but they weren't cooperating either. Exactly the kind of scenario these techniques were designed for, Maria confirmed. Now, let's start practicing some basic applications. She divided the Marines into pairs and began teaching them the fundamental pressure point locations. The training was methodical and careful, with each Marine learning to apply just enough pressure to demonstrate the technique without causing injury to their partner. As the morning progressed, Maria was impressed by how quickly the Marines picked up the concepts she was teaching. These were men who were accustomed to learning complex skills under pressure, and they approached her instruction with the same intensity they brought to all their training. "Williams, you're applying too much pressure," Maria called out as she moved between the pairs of practicing Marines. "Remember, we're trying to disrupt nerve function temporarily, not cause permanent damage." "Yes, ma'am," Williams replied, adjusting his technique. After 2 hours of practice, Maria called a break. The Marines gathered around her, their expressions showing a mixture of excitement and professional curiosity about what they were learning. "How are you feeling about this so far?" she asked the group. "It's different from anything we've trained on before," Thompson said. "But I can see how it would be useful in a lot of situations." "The precision required is challenging," Rodriguez added. "You have to hit exactly the right spot with exactly the right amount of pressure. That's why we're going to spend a lot of time practicing," Maria said. "These techniques need to become second nature before you can use them effectively in high-stress situations." Corporal Williams raised his hand. "Ma'am, yesterday you demonstrated gun disarmament techniques. When are we going to work on those?" "This afternoon," Maria replied. "But we need to master the basic pressure points first. Gun disarmament uses several of these techniques in rapid sequence, so you need to be comfortable with each component before we put them together." After the break, Maria introduced more advanced pressure point applications. She showed the Marines how to target points that would cause temporary paralysis in arms and legs, and how to combine multiple pressure points for maximum effect. "The key to using these techniques in combat is speed and precision," she explained as she demonstrated a sequence that would immobilize an opponent's arm. "You don't have time to search for the right pressure point when someone is trying to kill you. You need to know exactly where to strike and do it instinctively." The afternoon session focused on weapon disarmament techniques. Maria started with knife disarmament, building on what she had demonstrated the day before. "Yesterday, I showed you the end result," she said as the Marines gathered around her in the center of the training room. "Today we're going to break it down step by step." She called Thompson forward to act as her training partner, and they went through the knife disarmament technique in slow motion, with Maria explaining each movement and its purpose. "The first movement redirects the attacker's energy away from your vital areas," she said as Thompson made a slow motion stab with a rubber training knife. "The second movement targets the pressure point that controls grip strength, causing the attacker to drop the weapon involuntarily." She demonstrated the sequence several times at different speeds, allowing the Marines to see how each component worked together to create the dramatic disarmament they had witnessed the day before. "The entire technique depends on timing," she explained. "If you move too early, the attacker can adjust their attack. If you move too late, you get stabbed. The window of opportunity is very small." The Marines practiced the knife disarmament technique in pairs, starting with very slow movements and gradually increasing speed as they became more comfortable with the sequence. Maria moved between the pairs, correcting techniques and offering encouragement. Jackson, you're telegraphing your movement. The attacker can see what you're going to do before you do it. She demonstrated the proper technique. Keep your initial movement small and explosive. Rodriguez, you're rushing the pressure point strike. Take your time and make sure you hit the right spot. Speed without accuracy is useless. As the afternoon wore on, the Marines began to master the basic techniques. Their military training and physical conditioning gave them advantages that civilian students wouldn't have, and their competitive nature drove them to push themselves harder than most people would. By late afternoon, several of the Marines were executing the knife disarmament technique with impressive speed and accuracy. Maria was pleased with their progress, but she knew that the real test would come when they tried to use these techniques under stress. "All right, Marines," she called out as the training session neared its end. "Tomorrow we're going to work on gun disarmament techniques, and we're going to start introducing stress elements to make the training more realistic." "What kind of stress elements?" Thompson asked. "Physical exhaustion, multiple attackers, poor lighting, loud noises, and time pressure," Maria replied. "These techniques need to work when you're tired, confused, and under fire. Training in perfect conditions is just the beginning." The Marines exchanged glances, and Maria could see the anticipation in their faces. These were men who thrived on challenges, and she had just promised them training that would push them to their limits. "Before we finish for today," Maria continued, "I want to address something that several of you have asked about. These techniques aren't magic, and they're not guaranteed to work in every situation. They're tools that increase your options in close-quarters combat scenarios." She looked around the group of Marines, making eye contact with each one. "The most important thing you need to understand is that these techniques are supplements to your existing training, not replacements for it. Your marksmanship, your tactics, your physical conditioning, your teamwork, all of that is still the foundation of your effectiveness as Marines." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Understood, ma'am. These are additional tools for situations where our standard techniques might not be sufficient." "Exactly right," Maria confirmed. "And remember, the best fight is the one you avoid entirely. These techniques are for situations where you don't have any other choice." As the Marines began to clean up the training area and prepare to leave, several of them approached Maria with additional questions and comments. "Ma'am," Lance Corporal Jackson said, "I just wanted to say that this training is unlike anything I've ever done before. It's challenging in a completely different way." "I'm glad you're finding it challenging," Maria replied. "If it was easy, it wouldn't be worth learning." Corporal Williams stepped up next. "Staff Sergeant, my partner, and I were talking during the break, and we realized that these techniques could have applications beyond combat situations. Self-defense for family members, security work after we leave the Corps, that kind of thing." "You're absolutely right," Maria said. "These techniques were originally developed by people who needed to defend themselves against larger, stronger opponents in everyday situations. The military applications came later." As the last of the Marines filed out of the training room, Maria began packing up her materials and cleaning the whiteboard. It had been a successful day, but she knew that the real challenges lay ahead. Teaching these Marines to execute the techniques under ideal conditions was just the first step. Making sure they could use them effectively in combat would require much more intensive training. Colonel Martinez appeared in the doorway as she was finishing her cleanup. "How did the first day go?" "Very well, sir. The Marines are picking up the techniques quickly, and their attitude has been excellent." "Any problems or concerns?" "No, sir. They're approaching this training with the same professionalism they bring to everything else they do." Maria shouldered her bag and turned to face Martinez. "They're asking good questions and pushing themselves to master the techniques." "Good to hear," Martinez said. "I've had several other units request information about this training program. Word is spreading quickly about what you demonstrated yesterday." Maria nodded. "I'm not surprised, sir. Marines talk to each other, and something this unusual was bound to generate interest. Are you prepared to expand the program if there's demand for it?" "Yes, sir. But I'd like to complete the training with this unit first and evaluate the results. That will give us a better understanding of how effective these techniques are for Marines with different backgrounds and skill levels. Sounds like a reasonable approach, Martinez agreed. How much longer do you think you'll need with this group? At least 2 more weeks for the basic techniques, and then ongoing training to maintain proficiency. These skills are perishable if they're not practiced regularly. Keep me informed of your progress. And, Staff Sergeant, excellent work so far. As Maria left training room 7 and walked across the courtyard toward her quarters, she reflected on how much had changed in just 2 days. The 27 Marines who had looked at her with skepticism and hostility were now eager students who respected her expertise and pushed themselves to master what she was teaching them. It was a familiar pattern from her years in the Marine Corps, but it never got old. There was something deeply satisfying about winning over skeptical Marines through competence and professionalism rather than rank or authority. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she introduced gun disarmament techniques and began adding stress elements to the training. But she was confident that the Marines were ready for whatever she could teach them. The evening air was cool as she walked, and the distant sounds of training from other parts of the base reminded her that she was part of something larger than herself. The techniques she was teaching these Marines would eventually be passed on to other units, and someday they might save lives in combat situations she couldn't imagine. That thought made all the skepticism and challenges worth it. 2 weeks had passed since Maria's first demonstration, and Training Room 7 had been transformed into something resembling a laboratory for combat techniques. The walls were now covered with anatomical charts showing pressure points and nerve pathways, and the floor was marked with tape indicating optimal positioning for various scenarios. The 27 Marines had absorbed everything Maria taught them with an intensity that impressed even her. This morning was different, though. Today was evaluation day. Colonel Martinez had arrived early, accompanied by a full Colonel Maria didn't recognize, and 2 other officers whose insignia suggested they were from Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico. Word about the program had apparently reached the highest levels of the Corps, and now senior leadership wanted to see the results for themselves. Staff Sergeant Santos, Colonel Martinez said as she entered the training room. I'd like you to meet Colonel Harrison from Marine Corps Combat Development Command, Major Thompson from Training and Education Command, and Captain Rodriguez from Force Structure Planning Group. Maria snapped to attention as she greeted the visiting officers. She could see the assessment in their eyes as they looked her over, taking in her decorations and trying to reconcile her appearance with the reports they had undoubtedly received about her capabilities. Staff Sergeant, Colonel Harrison said, we've heard some interesting things about the program you've been developing here. We'd like to see a demonstration of what these Marines have learned. Yes, sir, Maria replied. The Marines have mastered the basic techniques and are ready to demonstrate their capabilities under stress conditions. The 27 Marines filed into the training room, their bearing sharp and professional despite the early hour. Maria could see the confidence in their movements, the way they carried themselves like Marines who had mastered something new and valuable. Gentlemen, Maria announced to the group, we have visitors from headquarters today who want to see what you've learned. We're going to conduct a comprehensive evaluation that will test all the techniques we've practiced over the past 2 weeks. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward. What kind of evaluation, Staff Sergeant? Multiple scenarios under stress conditions. Armed and unarmed opponents, multiple attackers, low-light conditions, and physical exhaustion protocols. Maria paused, looking at each Marine. Everything we've trained for. The visiting officers exchanged glances. Major Thompson spoke up. Staff Sergeant, are you saying these Marines can reliably execute complex combat techniques while under physical and psychological stress? Yes, sir. But I think it would be better to show you than tell you. Maria gestured to the Marines, who began setting up the training area for the first scenario. They moved with practiced efficiency, arranging equipment, and establishing safety protocols with the kind of precision that came from weeks of intensive training. The first scenario involves disarming multiple armed attackers in a confined space, Maria explained to the visiting officers. Lance Corporal Jackson will be the primary defender, facing 3 opponents armed with knives in a simulated building interior. She turned to the Marines. Jackson, you know the drill. Neutralize all 3 attackers using the techniques we've practiced. Everyone else, you're witnesses. Call out any safety violations or technique errors you observe. Jackson nodded and moved to the center of the training area, which had been configured to simulate a small room with limited maneuvering space. 3 Marines positioned themselves around him, each holding a rubber training knife and wearing protective gear. "Begin," Maria called out. What followed was a display of controlled violence that left the visiting officer speechless. Jackson moved through the 3 attackers like he had been doing it his entire life, using the pressure point techniques and disarmament methods Maria had taught him to neutralize each threat in sequence. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. "Time," Maria announced. "Jackson, report." 3 attackers neutralized, no weapons discharged, no friendly casualties, Jackson reported, standing at attention while the 3 Marines who had played his opponents picked themselves up from the mats. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his expression showing a mixture of amazement and skepticism. That was impressive, but those Marines were cooperating with the scenario. What happens against opponents who are actually trying to hurt the defender? "Good question, sir," Maria replied. "Thompson, Williams, Rodriguez, full contact scenario. Use maximum resistance short of causing actual injury." The 3 Marines Maria had called forward were among the largest and most experienced in the unit. Thompson alone outweighed Jackson by at least 40 pounds, and Williams had earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive fighters in the group. "Jackson," Maria said, "same scenario, but this time your opponents are going to do everything they can to take you down. Stay within the safety protocols, but otherwise treat this as a real fight." Jackson nodded, his expression serious as he faced off against 3 Marines who were no longer playing the role of cooperative training partners. "Begin." The difference in intensity was immediately apparent. Thompson, Williams, and Rodriguez attacked Jackson with the kind of aggression they would use in actual combat, their movements fast and violent as they tried to overwhelm him with superior size and numbers. Jackson's response was a masterpiece of applied technique. He flowed between his attackers like water, using their aggression against them and applying the pressure point techniques with surgical precision. Within 8 seconds, all 3 Marines were on the ground, their weapons scattered across the training mats. The visiting officers stood in stunned silence for several moments before Colonel Harrison found his voice. "That was remarkable," he said slowly. "I've never seen anything like it." "Sir," Maria said, "would you like to see the same techniques applied to firearms scenarios?" Major Thompson stepped forward before Harrison could answer. "Staff Sergeant, I have to ask, how is this possible? These Marines have only been training in these techniques for 2 weeks. How can they already be executing them against full resistance?" "Because they're Marines, sir," Maria replied simply. "They came to this training with excellent physical conditioning, strong tactical instincts, and years of experience in high-stress combat situations. All I did was give them new tools to add to their existing capabilities." She gestured to the Marines, who were resetting the training area for the next demonstration. "These techniques aren't magic. They're based on human physiology and physics. Marines who understand those principles and practice the applications can master them relatively quickly." Captain Rodriguez, who had been taking notes throughout the demonstration, looked up from his notebook. "Staff Sergeant, what's the failure rate for Marines attempting to learn these techniques?" "In this group, 0%, sir. Every Marine has successfully mastered the basic applications. Some are more naturally gifted than others, but all of them can execute the techniques reliably. And in combat situations, I can't give you statistics on that, sir, because this is the first group to receive this training. But the techniques these Marines have learned are the same ones I've used successfully in combat on 3 different deployments." The firearms demonstration that followed was even more impressive than the knife disarmament scenarios. Maria had the Marines work through increasingly complex situations, starting with single attackers and building up to multiple opponents with various weapons. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated the handgun disarmament technique against Corporal Williams, who was armed with a training pistol and under orders to fire as soon as he felt threatened. Rodriguez executed the disarmament so quickly that Williams never had the opportunity to pull the trigger. "The key is moving faster than the opponent's decision-making process," Maria explained to the visiting officers. "Most people, Even highly trained ones need about half a second to recognize a threat and respond to it. If you can complete your technique in less time than that, you control the outcome. The demonstrations continued for 2 hours, with the Marines working through scenarios that tested every aspect of their training. They performed flawlessly, adapting the techniques to different situations and maintaining their effectiveness even when exhausted and under pressure. As the formal evaluation concluded, Colonel Harrison approached Maria with an expression that mixed professional admiration with something approaching awe. Staff Sergeant Santos, I've been in the Marine Corps for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what these Marines demonstrated today. He paused, choosing his words carefully. How confident are you that these techniques can be taught to other Marines with similar results? Very confident, sir. The Marines in this unit aren't unique in their capabilities. Any Marines with similar training backgrounds and physical conditioning should be able to achieve comparable results. Major Thompson stepped into the conversation. What about Marines with different backgrounds? Infantry versus logistics, enlisted versus officers, different age groups. The techniques will work for anyone who's willing to put in the training time, sir. But the speed at which someone masters them will depend on their existing skill base and physical condition. Maria looked at the group of Marines who were cleaning up the training area with their usual efficiency. These Marines had advantages that made the learning process faster than it might be for other groups. What kind of timeline are we talking about for broader implementation? Captain Rodriguez asked. That depends on how broadly you want to implement it, sir. Training a small number of instructor Marines would take about 6 months. Those instructors could then train others, but it would be a gradual process. Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. We need to discuss this at higher levels, but I can tell you that what we've seen today has significant implications for Marine Corps training doctrine. As the visiting officers prepared to leave, they spent several minutes talking individually with the Marines who had participated in the demonstrations. Maria watched their interactions with interest, noting how the Marines answered questions with the confidence that came from mastering challenging new skills. Staff Sergeant Santos, Sergeant Thompson said as the visiting officers departed, "The guys wanted me to thank you for everything you've taught us. This training has been unlike anything we've done before." "You've all done excellent work," Maria replied. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished." Lance Corporal Jackson stepped forward. "Ma'am, we were wondering, is this training going to continue? Are we going to learn more advanced techniques?" Maria smiled. "That depends on what headquarters decides to do with the program. But, yes, there are more advanced applications we could explore if given the opportunity." "Like what?" Corporal Williams asked. "Multiple weapon types, improvised weapons, techniques for different environments, integration with existing tactical procedures." Maria gestured to the training room around them. "What you've learned so far is just the foundation. There are dozens of additional techniques that could be useful in different situations." The Marines exchanged excited glances, and Maria could see their enthusiasm for continued training. These were men who thrived on learning new skills and pushing their capabilities to new levels. As the day wound down, and the Marines prepared to return to their regular duties, Maria found herself reflecting on what had been accomplished over the past 2 weeks. 27 skeptical Marines had been transformed into practitioners of techniques that could give them significant advantages in close-quarters combat situations. More importantly, they had learned to respect capabilities that didn't fit traditional stereotypes about size, strength, and fighting ability. That lesson alone might be worth more than all the technical skills she had taught them. Colonel Martinez appeared in the doorway as Maria was packing up her training materials. "The visiting officers were impressed," he said without preamble. "Good to hear, sir. More than impressed, actually." Colonel Harrison called it the most significant advancement in close-quarters combat training he's seen in his career. Martinez paused. He wants to fast-track the program for broader implementation. Maria looked up from her packing. "How broad are we talking about, sir?" "Corps-wide, eventually, starting with special operations units and working down to general infantry." Martinez's expression was serious. This could affect how we train every Marine who might face close-quarters combat situations. "That's a big responsibility, sir." "Yes, it is. And it starts with you training a cadre of instructor Marines who can take this program to other units." He handed her a folder. Your new orders. You're being transferred to Quantico to develop the curriculum and train the first group of instructors. Maria opened the folder and scanned the orders. The assignment was everything she had hoped for when she first developed these techniques, but it also represented a massive increase in responsibility and pressure. When do I report, sir? 2 weeks. That gives you time to complete the documentation on this program and prepare for the transition. As Martinez left, Maria looked around Training Room 7 one final time. In this room, she had taken a group of skeptical Marines and taught them techniques that could save their lives in combat. More importantly, she had proven that the Marine Corps was ready to embrace new approaches to training and combat, regardless of where those approaches came from. The 27 Marines who had started this journey as skeptics had become believers, and now they would help spread these techniques throughout the Corps. It was more than she had dared hope for when she first walked into this room 2 weeks ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she prepared for the next phase of her career, but tonight she could take satisfaction in knowing that she had made a difference in the lives of 27 Marines who would carry these techniques with them wherever their service took them. The sun was setting over Camp Pendleton as she walked back to her quarters, and the familiar sounds of Marines training echoed across the base. Somewhere in those sounds was the next generation of Marines who would benefit from what had been accomplished in Training Room 7. That thought made everything worthwhile. 6 months later, Maria stood in front of the Marine Corps Combat Development Command headquarters at Quantico, watching a steady stream of Marines entering the building for what had become known throughout the Corps as Santos training. The program that had started with 27 skeptical Marines at Camp Pendleton had grown into something she never could have imagined. The morning briefing room was packed with Marines from every corner of the Corps. Infantry Marines sat next to logistics specialists, officers mixed with enlisted personnel, and Marines from units as diverse as Force Reconnaissance and military police filled every available seat. What they all had in common was that they were here to learn techniques that could save their lives. Maria had spent the past 6 months developing comprehensive training curricula, writing technical manuals, and training a cadre of instructor Marines who were now spread across bases worldwide. The feedback from units that had implemented the training had been overwhelmingly positive, with reports of successful applications in combat zones throughout the Middle East and Africa. "Good morning, Marines," Maria said as she stepped to the front of the briefing room. The conversations that had filled the space immediately stopped, and every eye in the room focused on her. "I'm Staff Sergeant Santos, and over the next 2 weeks, you're going to learn techniques that will give you options in close-quarters combat situations you might not have considered before." A hand shot up from the middle of the room. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Davis from 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. My unit has heard stories about this training, but a lot of Marines are skeptical that techniques like this can really work in combat." Maria nodded. It was the same skepticism she had faced from the beginning, and she had learned that the best way to address it was through demonstration rather than explanation. "Sergeant Davis, would you mind helping me with a demonstration?" Davis stood up, revealing himself to be a tall, powerfully built Marine with the confident bearing of someone who had seen extensive combat. As he made his way to the front of the room, Maria could see other Marines watching with the kind of interest that came from wanting to see if the stories they had heard were actually true. "Sergeant Davis, according to your unit patch, you've done deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed to disarm an opponent in close quarters?" "Yes, ma'am. Several times." "What techniques did you use?" "Standard military doctrine, ma'am. Overwhelming force, backup from other Marines, tactical advantages." Davis paused. "Basically, we used superior numbers and firepower to control the situation. And that worked?" "Most of the time, yes, ma'am." "What about the times it didn't work?" Maria asked, and she could see Davis's expression change as he remembered situations that hadn't gone according to plan. "There were a few times when we couldn't use our standard advantages. Tight spaces, civilian populations, situations where we had to be more surgical in our approach." Maria nodded. "Those are exactly the kinds of situations these techniques were designed for. Would you like to see how they work?" Davis nodded, and Maria could see the skepticism in his eyes mixed with genuine curiosity. "I want you to attack me with this," Maria said, handing him a rubber training knife. Use whatever technique you think would be most effective. Davis took the training weapon and studied it for a moment before looking back at Maria. Ma'am, are you sure about this? I outweigh you by at least 60 pounds. I'm sure, Sergeant. Attack me like you would attack an enemy who was trying to kill you. Davis positioned himself in a combat stance, the training knife held in a grip that showed he had received extensive knife fighting training. The Marines in the briefing room leaned forward in their seats, wanting to see how this confrontation would play out. Without warning, Davis launched himself forward in an attack that was fast, aggressive, and technically sound. His approach was exactly what Maria would have expected from a highly trained Marine with extensive combat experience. What happened next took exactly 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds changed the perspective of every Marine in the room. Maria moved like lightning, her response so fast that many of the watching Marines couldn't follow the sequence of actions that left Davis face down on the floor with his arm twisted behind his back and the training knife in Maria's hand. The briefing room fell completely silent. Davis lay on the floor for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened to him. When Maria released him and helped him to his feet, his expression showed a mixture of shock, confusion, and newfound respect. What the hell was that? He said, rubbing his shoulder where Maria had applied pressure to a nerve cluster. That was a combination of 3 techniques working together, Maria replied. Pressure point disruption, momentum redirection, and joint manipulation. The entire sequence is designed to work against opponents who are larger and stronger than you are. She looked out at the room full of Marines, noting how their expressions had changed from skepticism to intense interest. The techniques Sergeant Davis just experienced are based on human physiology and physics. They don't depend on being bigger or stronger than your opponent. They depend on understanding leverage, timing, and anatomy. A different Marine raised his hand. Ma'am, I'm Corporal Johnson from 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing. That looked like martial arts movie stuff. Does it really work against someone who's fighting back? Excellent question, Corporal. Sergeant Davis, were you fighting back? Davis nodded vigorously. Yes, ma'am. I was trying to stab you with everything I had. And the technique still worked? Yes, ma'am. I never had a chance to adjust my attack or defend myself. It was over before I knew what was happening. Maria addressed the room again. These techniques have been tested in combat situations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. They've been used successfully by Marines facing everything from knife attacks to armed insurgents in close quarters. Another hand went up. Ma'am, how long does it take to learn these techniques well enough to use them in combat? That depends on your existing skill base and how much time you can dedicate to training, Maria replied. Most Marines can learn the basic applications in 2 to 4 weeks of intensive training. Mastering them to the point where they become instinctive takes longer. What do you mean by instinctive? Asked a female Marine from the back of the room. I mean being able to execute them correctly when you're exhausted, under fire, and making split-second decisions in life or death situations. Maria paused, looking at the faces around the room. Learning a technique in a controlled training environment is just the beginning. The real test comes when you have to use it when everything else is going wrong. Sergeant Davis, who had remained at the front of the room, raised his hand again. Ma'am, you mentioned that these techniques have been used in combat. Can you give us specific examples? Maria considered how much detail she could share in an open briefing. I can tell you about my own experiences. In Helmand Province, I used these techniques when my squad was overrun by Taliban fighters. Traditional tactics weren't working because we were in a confined space with limited maneuverability. The room was completely quiet as Maria continued. I had to neutralize 4 enemy combatants in close quarters while under fire. The techniques I used are variations of what I just demonstrated to Sergeant Davis. And they worked, someone called out. I'm here talking to you. So yes, they worked. Maria's tone was matter of fact, but the implication was clear to every Marine in the room. A master sergeant near the front of the room stood up. Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm Master Sergeant Williams from School of Infantry East. We've heard reports from units that have received this training, and the feedback has been extremely positive. But I have to ask, why weren't these techniques part of standard Marine Corps training before now? It was a question Maria had been asked many times over the past 6 months, and she had given it considerable thought. Because the Marine Corps has traditionally focused on techniques that work well for the average Marine in the most common combat scenarios, she replied. These techniques require more individual training time, and they work best for Marines who are facing opponents with significant size or strength advantages. She gestured to the group of Marines. As our operating environment has changed, we found ourselves in more situations where traditional advantages like superior firepower and numbers aren't available. These techniques give Marines additional options for those situations. Master Sergeant Williams nodded thoughtfully. And the Corps has decided that these additional options are worth the training investment? Yes. The Commandant himself has endorsed Corps-wide implementation of this training program. A murmur of conversation ran through the room. Having the personal endorsement of the Commandant of the Marine Corps carried significant weight with every Marine.